On this day of discovery, author and Cornerstone University President Joe Stoll travels to modern Turkey to the excavations of two ancient cities, Thyatira and Philadelphia. These first-century communities were home for 2 of 7 churches specifically addressed in the beginning of the book of Revelation, a revelation from the resurrected Jesus received in a vision by the Apostle John. At the end of the first century, Christianity is facing mounting opposition in the empire. John is a prisoner on the island of Patmos for his faith in one God, which goes against a Roman Empire that embraces many gods, chief among them the Caesar of Rome. It is on Patmos that Jesus appears to John to send a message to the world, a message that is today what we know as the Book of Revelation. But to the first century church, letters of challenge and hope. Journey to the 7 churches of Revelation, the letters to Thyatira and Philadelphia on this day of discovery.
What you see, write in a book and send it to the 7 churches which are in Asia, to Ephesus, to Smyrna, to Pergamos, to Thyatira, to Sardis, to Philadelphia, and to Laodicea. And to the angel of the church in Thyatira write, These things says the Son of God, who has eyes like a flame of fire, and his feet like fine brass. I know your works, love, service, faith, and your patience. And as for your works, the last are more than the first. Nevertheless, I have a few things against you, because you allow that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit sexual immorality and to eat things sacrificed to idols. And I gave her time to repent of her sexual immorality, and she did not repent. Indeed, I will cast her into a sickbed, and those who commit adultery with her into great tribulation, unless they repent of their deeds. And he who overcomes and keeps my works until the end, to him I will give power over the nations, and I will give him the morning star. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches.
This is the town of Thyatira, or at least what's left of it, bunkered down into the bustling city of Akhisar, Turkey. These are the remains and ruins of this town where the early church grew up. Originally, Thyatira was founded by Alexander the Great as a military garrison. His soldiers worshipped the god Apollo. He was their patron god. He was called the Son of God. By the time the early church grew up in this town in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, it was a very prosperous town. Well, not like Pergamum or Ephesus or even Smyrna, those world-class cities. It was just kind of your average town. Maybe like the town you grew up in. But its major commodities were what drove the prosperity. Its lead commodity was textiles. In fact, the water here in Thyatira was so rich in minerals that no place else in the world could make a red textile so brilliant and so bold. It was desired worldwide. In fact, interesting, Lydia, who met Paul and accepted Christ in Philippi and entertained Paul, Lydia was a seller of purple from Thyatira. Its bronzesmiths were famous. Its silversmiths made some of the best silver pieces in the world. Its pottery was coveted. And in this town, believers were commended by Jesus Christ. He opens his letter by saying, I know your works, your love, your service, your faithful endurance. And then he adds, and that the works you do today are better than the works you did before. This was a church on an upward trajectory. And that's remarkable, given the pressures that early Christians faced in this town. So here's what early Christians were up against. The entire social, industrial, religious structure of Thyatira was built around the guilds. Now, a guild was like a labor union. Every single craft had its own guild. The textile people had a guild, the bronzesmiths, the silversmiths, they all belonged to their own guild. Now, it just wasn't like a labor union. It was more than that. That was the heart of their social function, their religious function, as well as their work. And Thyatira was a closed shop town. Periodically, the guilds would hold great festivals for all the members of their guild. The problem for Christians was that these festivals were held in the temple to Apollo, who was the patron of the guilds, as he was the patron to the military garrison that was here. Apollo, who was called the Son of God. So these grand guild festivities were held there. They would worship Apollo, they would eat and fellowship, and often involved themselves in sexual immorality. So what's a Christian to do? Well, if you said, I'm not going, you risked the success of the guild, because maybe Apollo would be angry with your particular kind of craft or function. So needless to say, the guild only had one option, and that was to expel you. You lost your job. You know, in Pergamum, Christians faced the tremendous pressure of not worshiping in the temples and not worshiping the emperor, and perhaps for that would lose their lives. In Thyatira, they lost their jobs. It hit them where it hurts the most, right in the pocketbook. And every follower of Christ had to make a choice. It would be Jesus or his career. But in spite of the commendations that Jesus gives to these early followers, he says, but I have something against you, that you tolerate the prophetess Jezebel in your midst. The context of the letter seems to indicate that this was a prophetess woman in the church who encouraged people not to quit their jobs, but to go to the festivities of Apollo and to participate in eating meat offered to idols and the immorality. No one is quite sure what her philosophy was or her theology was, maybe something like the Nicolaitans. But it is clear that she spun a kind of intellectual approach, which Jesus refers to as the deep things of Satan. So that maybe she would approach people and say, let me clue you in to think deeply about this, more carefully about this. And you don't need to be like these silly people who refuse to go to the temple. We're not sure what she said. We just know that she was a problem. We know that she was a problem because Jesus called her Jezebel, not a compliment. I mean, nobody in the early church is naming their little girls Jezebel, because in the Old Testament, she was the wife of Israel's most wicked king, Ahab. And she introduced the worship of Baal, the idolatry to Baal, to Israel. And Israelites were worshiping Baal to the extent of sacrificing their children to Baal and participating in the immoral sexuality of worship to Baal. And God so judged Ahab and Jezebel that it was the last straw before their captivity to the enemy forces. So compromising to save our skin, to make life a little easier, is a huge problem to Jesus Christ. And the warnings in the letter sound a very serious note against her teachings. I love how Jesus starts this letter. And if you were a marginalized believer in Thyatira, you'd love it too. Because he identifies himself as the Son of God. That's what Apollo called himself, the patron god of the guilds. And Jesus says, I am the Son of God. And then in reference to the bronze smiths, he says, my feet are like burnished bronze. And in reference to the refining fires of the industry here, my eyes are like flames of fire. What a marvelous, powerful picture of Jesus, who is so far above and over all the things that have plagued their lives. And in this letter, this Son of God, the choice is clear. Don't let Jezebel muddle it up. How much is Jesus worth to you? What kind of value do you place on him? Would you value your job, your career, your economy more than him? That's the choice. And so he says to the faithful who have not capitulated and compromised, he says to them, hold fast till I come. I love that. You know, this isn't the end game for them. The future is still ahead, and Jesus is coming back again for them. And then he makes them a promise. And the promise is this, that they will reign with authority over the nations. This weak, marginalized church that has no power, they will rule the nations. He says, I will give you a scepter of iron, and with my Father you will smash the vessels of the authorities of this earth that have so oppressed and persecuted you. And then he really seals the deal with this promise. And I will give you the bright and morning star. What is that? Well, in ancient times, all the way back to Babylonian times, Venus, the morning star, was seen as the source of ultimate authority. Maybe that's what he meant. But I like to think it's Jesus Christ himself. Because in Revelation chapter 21, Christ is called the bright and morning star. So he says, I will give you myself, that where I am, there you might be also, an eternal fellowship with the Son of God, Jesus Christ. What a promise. I would say that's something to persevere for. You know, in retail today, they have what is called a loss leader. That means you sell something and lose something up front on some particular piece of merchandise to get people in your store so they'll buy some more. Seems to me like losing your job for Jesus is like a loss leader. You pay a price up front for a really big gain at the end. And that's what Jesus calls us to valuing him more than anything else, regardless of the price. And he says to us, for those who endure, great is your reward in heaven.